Good afternoon. I was a bit confused about the working language, but I was told that it's any of possible languages, so we stick to English. All those who need translation, I think there is an opportunity to obtain devices. Sorry for slight delay, but as you know, Gaidar Forum is one of the most dynamic and the biggest event we have annually in this city. So it's very flexible, so it changes. We try to catch up during our discussion. We have enormously brilliant panel, so I don't need to spend much time on myself. Maybe I will try to intervene in between to guide our distinguished panelists, as we used to do in Russia, to guide to the right direction and to correct your wrong European assessments. But the only thing I would like to say, we discuss the official title of our discussion is Europe after Brexit, but I think it's of course much broader phenomenon because Brexit was a very important and characteristic event, but actually it's not about Brexit in particular because Europe is changing. We see European political landscape changing quite rapidly and significantly. We see constructions, ideas, and institutions which seem to be pretty axiomatic and indispensable very recently, turning into turmoil and losing relevance or at least appealing for a change. And I'm absolutely sure that those in Russia who believe, and there are plenty of them, who believe that European Union is doomed to fail will be disappointed in years to come. But it's absolutely clear to many of us that the European Union will be different. And the model of integration which served purposes of European unity since mid-20th century and which was extremely successful during the Cold War and immediately after the Cold War, but now it is basically completed. I would not say exhausted, but completed. And something new is in high demand. So I hope that our panelists now will not only describe what is happening in the old world, but also outline a little bit what kind of changes we can expect, if any. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce the first speaker, Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. I can say, Mr. Wolf, that Financial Times is the paper in this country, and all those who would like to stay on course, they first thing in the morning they read Financial Times and your pieces as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Oh, well, I didn't know what the procedure was going to be here. So you want me to speak for 2 or 3 minutes about this question of Brexit, Europe after Brexit, or I will focus on Brexit. So at this stage, okay. I didn't know what the procedure was. Haven't prepared anything particularly. So what I will focus on is my perception of why Brexit happened. What I think is likely to happen over the next a few years in the relationship of Britain and Europe, the EU, which is obviously a set of guesses since the negotiations have started. And then I will discuss very briefly what mean for the rest of the EU, but that will be quite brief and I'll be interested in other people's views. So on the first point, why did Brexit happen? It's quite interesting, I think. Well, first, it's pretty obvious that to anyone who follows this closely, that Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe is somewhat historically different from that, at least of the other big countries. Its experience in both the First and above all the Second World Wars were completely different. Its view of its geopolitical position is different. It's a long-standing imperial power with relations with English-speaking countries around the world. And as a result of this, it has never has had at the popular level, outside tiny elite circles, any profound commitment to the European ideal of political integration. This has never been there. Britain, and this is very relevant, Britain entered the EU after seeking it in the 60s, in the aftermath of the decision to end the empire, quite deliberately by Harold Macmillan, in the context of a growing perception of profound economic failure. Because in the 50s and 60s, the British economy grew very slowly relative to that of all other European countries of significance, and I mean less than half the rates of the other countries. And Britain was seen as a cripple in its own eyes. And that was enough for it to join the EU as a marriage of convenience. It was not a profound moral commitment, it was a marriage of convenience. It has continued to be a marriage of convenience, but it became more obvious over time that the fact that Britain didn't share these fundamental objectives meant that Britain was not going to participate in any of the major programs of integration, above all the currency union, after the single market, which was sort of the last thing the British government felt it should get involved in, because Mrs. Thatcher was persuaded that the single market was a method of extending Thatcherism to Europe. That was the idea. And after that, the British have been increasingly in the naysaying campaign, naysaying position. Anything that's proposed must be wrong because these people are not what we really want to be with. And this followed really very importantly Mrs. Thatcher's Bruges speech in the late 80s. So there you have this semi-detached country. Then two other things happened which were very fascinating, and they're related. First, the relative economic performance of Britain vis-a-vis the rest of Europe improved. Actually, the absolute performance didn't improve very much, if at all. I would say not at all. But the relative performance improved basically because the performance of much of the rest of Europe deteriorated so much. And that may reduce the British sense of inferiority. I'm not suggesting this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying what happened. And the second thing is that the British right shifted from a position in which basically everyone in Britain was less friendly towards the market and the market economy than the centre of gravity of the European Union. The European Union didn't change at all, but Britain moved to the right. That's pretty clear what happened. And so suddenly we had a Conservative Party which was sort of rather radically free market. And they found this in the whole structure of Europe, its regulatory machine, increasingly unhappy. And then final thing that happened, so that's an important reason for dissatisfaction. And the final thing that happened was an incredibly foolish decision, as it turned out in retrospect, under the most pro-European government we have had in the last 40 years, apart from Ted Heath's government, which took us in, namely Tony Blair's, to go out in front of everybody else, and when enlargement occurred, to accept all the immigrants from enlargement countries. I was pretty nervous about that decision then, but it had much bigger consequences than I suppose, because it then got wrapped up in the migration issue. And at the end of all this process, the Conservative Party was riven on this issue. David Cameron had no really strong views on this. He was pretty semi-detached. He was concerned about UKIP, the Independence Party, taking votes from him. And so and I won't go into more, there's lots of other history of this. He basically made a promise that we will have a referendum. He didn't think through what the implications were. He was ill-advised or didn't think about whether he'd get what he wanted in the negotiation, which immigration was a core issue. He failed to get any significant changes. He went into this referendum as a result, partly, of the fact that he won the last election, which no one expected. He never expected to have this referendum. It was an accident. But for the reasons I've suggested, we went into this in a very fragile position. There wasn't much strong support for EU. very few people really were passionately committed. There was a lot of fairly passionate commitment against, but not more than a third of the population. And there were lots of people who were worried about other things, immigration issues, the effect of the financial crisis. That's what he went into. He ran a lousy campaign and he lost. So that's basically, incredibly briefly, I think, how we ended up where we are. I could talk about that for an hour or two straight, but that's roughly where we got. It's not what he wanted, but he was a disaster. Okay. What's going to happen? After Cameron resigned, in this wonderful way politics has, the two principal conspirators in Brexit proceeded to, I think it's wonderful, it's Shakespearean really, to put knives very firmly in each other's backs. And they did it publicly, so they were facing each other as they did it. And so they died, and that left Theresa May standing. And Theresa May is that remarkable thing in politics, somebody who knows when to shut up. It's very rare to have a politician who knows when to shut up, and she does. I think that's actually one of Angela Merkel's virtues. When another thing of a general theory of mine which is that women are much better at politics. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So she shut up, and therefore she had fewer enemies than anybody else, because nobody really knew what her position was on anything. And not having nobody knowing what her position was in anything means that she has very few enemies. And minimizing your enemies is unbelievably important in politics. So she became the leader. She was everybody's second choice. Very simple. Being everybody's second choice, you become leader. Now, she, however, has some emotional commitments. She is a little Englander, as Cameron was, but even more so. She has no global ambitions whatsoever, as far as I can see, for the country. It's never concerned her. She knows nothing about economics and has never held an economic job. That's all right. Lots of great politicians know nothing about economics. Winston Churchill was probably the worst chancellor in the history of Britain, but he was still quite important at certain moments. But she does have some principles, which are her own principles, and this is her own principles, things she believes in, and they are the core principles of her party in the post-Brexit situation. And she set them out. We will have controls on immigrants. We will. It's not negotiable. And two, we will not accept ECJ rulings. And that follows from that we will leave the single market. There's not the slightest question. It's not even an interesting question. All sorts of idiots talk about this as if it's a question. It's not a question. And the only question is when some other sort of trade deal might be done within the 2-year period of these negotiations. The only one that I think is simple and would be compatible with these objectives would be for us to stay in the customs union. But in practice, I think that's not going to happen either, because it would rule out. I'm not suggesting the other EU partners would want it, but if we were to stay in the customs union, it means we can't have any trade deals with anybody else, at least not on tariffs. And lots of people want these trade deals. They're incredibly excited about doing deals with the US and all the rest of this sort of stuff. So that's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to sign a free trade agreement in the time available. So we're going to be out. We're going to be out. The only question in my mind is whether 2 years from now we will be out, that is to say, basically trading on WTO terms. We can discuss the details of that, with an exit agreement with the EU or without an exit agreement. My own guess is without one, but I might be wrong. So it will be ultra hard, that is to say, complete chaos. It should be noted that the person who wrote, I'm told by the person concerned, somebody here can correct me, who wrote Article 50, which gives you the 2-year deadline unless extended by unanimous agreement, was a British civil servant, John Kerr. And it was designed to be impossible to use. And being a very, very intelligent civil servant, he achieved that objective. He thought, because it was so impossible to use that no sensible politician would try it, but he was not thinking of Mr. Cameron, who doesn't didn't know what was going on. So that's what's going to happen. So I think it will be crash out. Overwhelmingly probable it will be crash out. The third question is, what does it mean for Europe? Well, in a strange way, what I've described is going to be quite simple, it seems to me. The rest of the EU should focus on the negotiation of the exit process. There's one qualification, and then say goodbye. It'll be quite disruptive. There is only one other possible thing, and which I'd be interested in, that there might be some people in Britain seem to believe that somebody in Europe might say, well, if you pay enough money to us, we'll waive these problems about immigration, and perhaps we can put the ECJ to one side because most people in Britain don't understand it. We'll allow you to introduce some controls on immigration if you spend enough money. Well, there might be enough money to make that possible. I don't see that deal's flying in Britain either. I think the popular press will kill it. So what will it mean for the rest of Europe? Well, the rest of Europe will have to make a really fine job of looking after themselves without British participation. That shouldn't be too difficult with one qualification. They've made a spectacular mess of their affairs without any contribution on our part. And the British did not create the Eurozone problem, which is a monumental one. Should never have been created, in my view. I've been absolutely consistent on this for a quarter of a century. And I don't think the Europeans know how to fix that, but I might be wrong. But anyway, Britain's out of the picture. They've got a nice big mess of their own in every possible direction, internally, splits illiberal democracy and all the rest of it. And as a British person, I would have to say good luck.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf. My follow-up question will be just to clarify. Do you think, because you started with description that Britain has always been a semi-detached part of the European Community Union, and then you describe the political situation, and it looks like a terrible political mistake, recklessness, and so on. Do you think that it was just a coincidence of circumstances that it happened, or it was inevitable in any way?
The way I think about these sorts of questions, I'll put the general Wolf theory about how things screw-ups happen. I apologize, because I'm a journalist, not a respectable academic. But I think it also applies, why do financial crises happen? Why do wars happen? I don't believe in predestination. I'm not a Calvinist. I don't believe in predestination. The world is not predetermined. But sometimes, and we can describe, you are in a zone of instability. Okay? And sometimes you're not at all. So if I were asked the following question, a zone of instability, what are the chances of populist plebiscitary dictatorship or populist nationalist dictatorship in Switzerland? Zero. So it's not in the zone of instability. But Britain was permanently in the zone of instability in relationship to the Europe because the connections were weak. The commitment was weak. And furthermore, for the reasons I tried to lay out very quickly, relative economic performance, the fact that the EU proceeded with the Eurozone, which rightly or wrongly the British basically regard as crazy, and then they got the crisis and they didn't look very good, and we got the crisis which made us feel very bad. So a lot of things came together which pushed us further and further into the zone of instability. That is to say, where anything could happen in relationship to Europe. When you're in a situation like this, and you're a moderately sensible political leader, and you're aware of it, as I think, for instance, Angela Merkel is aware of the instability around her, you go to bed and get up every morning saying, what must I do not to destabilize the situation further? I must avoid whatever I can destabilizing the situation further. I must do everything I can to maintain stability to get through the next day and the day after. Mr. Cameron, this thought never crossed Mr. Cameron's mind. And so he duly did a series of things which maximize the likelihood that the potential instability will be crystallized. That was an accident. I could imagine other more circumspect politicians, not every British politician is a lunatic, avoiding that mistake. But Tony Blair made terrible mistakes. I mean, we have had a series of chances in recent times. I won't go into that in detail. But it seems to me it wasn't predestined. It's perfectly possible to have got through this. The British economy recovers, the European economy recovers. You play for time. And then you might move out to it. Everything starts looking better. If you have a good, strong recovery in Europe, a good, strong recovery in Britain, 5–10 years from now, all this might have gone. But he didn't. He decided to go for this referendum, as I said, partly a matter of bad luck. He won the election, and partly because he just didn't think about the risks, at a time of extreme fragility, 8 years after a crisis, 10 years of real income stagnation, continued very high levels of immigration. By the way, a lot of it from the EU, from the old EU, because of the crisis in the Eurozone, from Spain, from Italy, so forth, all mentioned in the figures, all appeared in the immigration figures. It was the worst possible time. And the essence of a referendum, in my view, and I'm absolutely against referenda in all circumstances, unless you're Swiss, is because we have a representative parliamentary democracy. Britain never in its entire history had a referendum till 1975. They're stupid ideas. They're basically lotteries. And once you're in a referendum situation, everything will be discussed and everything will be relevant to the voting decision except the actual question in front of you. And that's particularly true if it's a really technical question like leaving the EU, which, to put it very bluntly, and I think this might offend some people here, very, very few people understood the implications of actually leaving the EU. So having the referendum was foolish, and anyway, he crystallized the risk. But the risk was there for the reasons that I've given you, and there are countries in Europe in which the risk does not exist because being part of the EU is understood by the people, for historical reasons, others, as a fundamental existential interest of the country, and therefore the issue will never be raised because you're not in the zone of instability. That's, I think, the point I was trying to make.
Thank you very much. Being not in the zone of instability, that's a big advantage now these days, but unfortunately we see that some countries can move from zone of instability to another zone. If not Switzerland, of course. We know now the example which is safe. Yeah. That's quite, you mentioned predestiny, and when I think about predestiny, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think about German philosophy, because German philosophy traditionally in the past used to play with this concept and ideas. So the next question to Alexander Graf Lambsdorff, who is a German politician, a European politician, and Germany is the country which, as Mr. Wolf mentioned, existentially in favor of the European Union, because what I know about German mind, today's mind, Germany doesn't see itself outside the European Union, however. What is your view on the future of the European Union then?
Well, I was enjoying this. I think it was the best presentation on Brexit I've attended. I had to come to Moscow for that from Brussels. I mean, and I totally agree with everything you said. That usually it's always interesting when you have sort of, you can fight, but I totally agree. I would say though that on one issue I'd like to sort of add something. It was not just a mess up on the part of the Tory government. It was a lack of character strength. It was a move of opportunism. They were driven by right-wing populists who hate Europe, who really wanted this little England vision, England just for itself. And they sort of, put pressure on candidates from the Conservative Party across the country, which is politically perfectly legitimate. Now, your decision is, how do you fight them? Do you fight them by holding your ground, or do you fight them by moving in their direction? And if you have character strength, you hold your ground and you develop better arguments for your own positions. But what Cameron did is he moved their way and he gave them the referendum. So Nigel Farage, who's my colleague in the European Parliament, I mean, he had a field day. He loved it. He loved it. It was just great, the greatest thing that ever happened to him. And now he's best buddies with Donald Trump. I mean, it's the man, he's living a dream. It's incredible. Nigel Farage, we never expected that. However, having said all this, the one big question that many people asked is, oh, wow, this is a first. Never before has a country left the European Union. This must mean that its disintegration is now on the agenda. This is the beginning of the end of the European Union. This is wrong. And for many of the reasons that you've just heard from Martin Wolf. Great Britain has always been semi-detached, not in the Eurozone, not in the Schengen zone of free travel, has not accepted the social rights that are common to all Europeans, has not even accepted the Charter of Fundamental Rights. I mean, Britain has used the EU to further its own national interest for as long as it thought that was useful, and now it's out, and we are back to the situation where we were before, i.e. a European Union without Britain as we've had it from 1957 to 1973. It is not a problem to imagine the EU without Britain. It would be completely impossible to imagine the EU without France or Germany. For me, the biggest issue this year, Brexit, we'll handle Brexit. It says here, Europa после Brexit. But it's actually, we are during Brexit. We'll handle Brexit somehow. The Brits have much more problems with that because they don't know what they want. Really, I mean, have you, their ambassador just resigned in Brussels, Sir Ivan Rogers, a very, very respected ambassador. And he resigned because he said, I am supposed to represent a government that has no clue what it wants, has muddled thinking, and bad ideas. I mean, that's as damning as you can get as a civil servant. He, consequently retired from the civil service altogether. Britain is in disarray. The populists won this show, this referendum, but there was no substance to back up what they actually claimed they were pursuing, i.e. a decent deal for the United Kingdom while or after leaving the European Union. Politico, our major newspaper besides the Financial Times in Brussels, said, grab the popcorn, watch the spectacle, how the Brits are tearing themselves apart over this decision. For once, even the European corridors were silent, as the Brits are delivering a show to us that is just spectacular. However, for the rest, once Britain is out, new opportunities arise. Britain was a naysayer, as Martin just said, a naysayer. No, no, no. Like Господин Нет, Mr. Gromyko of yesteryear. And we will now be able to move forward in areas where that has not been possible before, particularly on issues of internal security and external security, fighting terrorism, fighting organized crime. We may get better police cooperation. We may get better cooperation of our prosecutors. We may actually move in the direction, not of a European army, that is a bit of a chimera, but in the direction of something of a European defense union, where we start getting serious finally about having our armed forces deciding they can't do everything because we're all too small, including Germany, but we may cooperate with our neighbors in a better way than we used before. The election of Donald Trump has contributed to this sort of line of thinking, because he said he's not going to defend any country with American troops that doesn't pay up its full share as the defense budget. So a number of things are going on, and while, and I say this now as a liberal, we regret to see the motherland of liberalism leave the European Union, that's my personal political view, as a European policymaker, I can say good riddance and turn to the continent and say, where can we now move ahead where the Brits have been vetoing us and have inhibited our progress. That's for us, I think, the next challenge, to identify these opportunities. And let me say one final thing. I believe it is absolutely crucial that we recognize one thing. Countries don't go out of business. Britain has not left the place where it is, and that is 30 kilometers from France. There's still a tunnel there. We still interact, our economies are integrated. So we need a deal that works for both sides. I think some rhetoric that comes out of some capitals in Europe that we now need to punish the Brits is completely wrong and stupid. We need a good deal for both sides.
Thank you very much. If I may, another follow-up question. You spoke mostly as a European politician. Can I ask you as a German politician? 2 years ago or so, a year and a half ago, we had the feeling that Germany, during this Greek crisis and many other elements of European development, political development, then time, it was a feeling that Germany finally decided to be more of a leader of the European Union and tighten the grip on transformation and so on. Frankly, today it doesn't look like this. The domestic situation in Germany is pretty complicated. We see that the election campaign this year most likely will be pretty nervous and difficult. From German perspective, what are chances that by the end of this year, by the end of this election campaign, we will have a government which will be able to push forward the European idea?
Fedor, let me first say I disagree with your description of the situation in Germany as nervous and difficult. We are saturated. We're nearing full employment. We've just had the figures for economic growth in 2016 approaching 2%. That's a big economy that's growing by nearly 2%, 1.9%. We have had an agitation over the refugee crisis. That is absolutely correct. But by and large, compared to other countries, both in the European Union and globally, Germany is extremely stable. And the Chancellor is very likely to stay on as the Chancellor following the elections. And as somebody once said, she's the only international leader who's completely sane. And competent. I mean, we look around and we see a weakened president in France. We see a resigned David Cameron. We see Donald Trump in Washington. We have a huge question mark here. We don't know exactly where Russia is headed. We look at Turkey and say, what is Mr. Erdogan up to? And you look at this landscape. Matteo Renzi is gone. He's out. The Spaniards have taken nearly a year to form a government. Poland is a real problem with the Kaczynskis, or Mr. Kaczynski back there again. So when I look, and I say this as an opposition politician, I will be fighting her party, okay? But when I look around, Chancellor Merkel is actually sort of a figure for stability and leadership. And so therefore I think, past September 17, when we have this German election, what you will see is some German government that will see Angela Merkel and her party in the lead, either with the Social Democrats or with a coalition that might include the Greens and our party. We don't know. But by and large, if there's one country that can exert leadership in Europe now, today, it is clearly Germany. My hope, and I'm very clear about this, is that the French are smart enough to elect a very good president, either Monsieur Macron or Monsieur Fillon, so that we can do it together, because Franco-German leadership, when it is exercised jointly, works. Leadership by one country is always extremely more difficult.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we can have further discussion on German situation, but later. President Klaus, you are a very well-known critic of the European Union, even before all this started. Now, I think your view might be more mainstream than before, but maybe I'm wrong, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I expected to have a minority position here at this panel. I hope not in the audience. I think that always the majority of the audience is on my side and the panel is against me. So this is the standard situation. I hope the same will be here now. I expected to have the minority view, but I did not expect, with all my respect, such aggressive attacks on the result of Brexit, on the free democratic results of free British voters. I am absolutely shocked about this, and I didn't expect that. I'm sorry to say that. Speaking for myself, I greeted the outcome of the last year's British referendum with great joy, because I do believe that its outcome has opened a new chapter in the European history, and I was definitely stressed positive chapter in the European history. I am convinced that Europe needed something like that very much. Several arguments. First, I agree with Mr. Lambsdorff when he says that, I put it slightly differently, but he made a similar point saying that the UK is not leaving Europe. That's very important. There is no need to panic. The British Islands will not move farther to the north, south, or west. They will stay here. The UK is just leaving one very unsuccessful entity called the European Union. Let's differentiate those things very, very clearly. I'm absolutely sure that this distinction is absolutely crucial, of crucial importance, because it's deliberately very often neglected. Second, reasons for the outcome of this referendum. I disagree with the intentionally misleading interpretation of the Brexit referendum, which suggests that the main topic of the referendum was the issue of migration. No. The dominant reason for the majority of Brits voting leave was their conviction that the decisions about the EU should be taken in about the UK should be taken in the UK. Something most of us in Europe, not in Brussels, share. This is for me absolutely fundamental, and not at least to address that issue is intellectually unacceptable for me. The approach of the majority of British voters was based on their long-term experience that the nation is and should be the primary political entity, the only possible embodiment and guarantor of democracy. I am absolutely sure, and everything confirms that position. The Brexit vote was a vote about freedom against EU political correctness. It was a vote about democracy against the EU post-democracy. It was a vote about sovereignty against multinationalism and global governments. It was a vote about economic prosperity against long-term stagnation and relative decline. And it was a vote about traditional, cultural and civilizational values and lifestyles against their denial in current EU. So the outcome of the British referendum was not a disaster. On the contrary, it was, in a positive way, important for all of us in Europe, not just for the Brits. This outcome was a symbolic, maybe perhaps a radical rejection of the faulty project of undemocratic, centralistic, dirigistic, overregulated, unnecessarily unified, harmonized and standardized European Union. So I hope that it will have a spillover. It will have external effects. This result confirmed the feelings of millions of ordinary people in Europe who are similarly critical of the contemporary version of the EU institutional arrangements, of the EU policies, and of the doctrine I sometimes call Europeism behind them. So the people in Europe have not a positive feeling about Europe, and this is quite rational. The people in Europe, not just in Britain, have been witnessing an evident decline of Europe for a long time. And they feel it. And this decline was not caused by the Islamist terrorists, by the recently started mass migration, by the rapidly growing China, by the awakening and resurgence of Russia, and so on. It was not caused by globalization nor by the incorporation of ex-communist Central and Eastern European countries into the elitist EU club. The decline was caused by us Europeans, by the European political elites. I can talk a long time about it, but I must say that I have to confess, as the only one from an ex-communist country, I have to confess that in the moment of the fall of communism, I did not expect to ever again experience such a loss of sovereignty as we experience in more and more centralistically organized EU. I didn't expect such an extent of government intervention in economic life in the fields such as agriculture and energy. It is not much different from the communist central planning, and I know something about the communist central planning. I didn't expect such an extent of political manipulation and of democratic deficit. I didn't expect such a massive media manipulation, and so on and so on. Well, I may be disappointed with the way how the Brits are behaving after the vote. This is for me a tragic, disappointing experience. I have some personal experience. We had a dramatic, radical, not referendum, but normal elections in June 1992. And the results of the elections told us the Slovaks don't want to go with us together in the then Czechoslovakia. And I was Prime Minister. I was forced to react next morning. And in 6 months' time, we signed 25 intergovernmental treaties between Czech Republic and Slovakia. We divided everything. The buildings of embassies all over the world and the military airplanes and the National Gallery and so on. We divided everything. We signed 25 degrees, and after six months the country was divided. And we were together 70 years, not just I don't know how it is with Great Britain and the EU. So in this respect, I am disappointed about the British reaction, but I think it's to the better of Europe. And when you say that there is a danger that the disintegration is on the agenda, so finally, luckily, it's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I see.
You see the audience is on my side. The panelists are on the other side.
You managed to manifest your minority position at the panel, and I hope, the only thing I hope that Britain will not need to divide the National Gallery, like Czechoslovakia had to do. So it will be a real tragedy. I see if you can make very short remarks, Alexander and then Martin.
Very briefly. What President Klaus just said, of course, I disagree with most of what he said, which is fine. That's absolutely fine in a democratic debate. I, however, must reject, because I come from an ex-communist country too. My country, half of it was communist for 40 years. The comparison of the European Union, the comparison of the European Union with the Warsaw Pact, with the communist bloc at the time, is illegitimate and it's propagandistic. Britain can leave. They can freely vote. They can choose to leave. There are no tanks in Wenceslas Square. There are no tanks in Times Square. Nobody's forcing them to stay. So that's why, you know, whenever you discuss politically, that's fine and we can disagree. But to use sort of the communist past of Central Europe as a comparison to what's going on in the European Union today, that I think is propaganda, pure and simple.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
I too obviously disagree with a great deal that Mr. Klaus said. I think, first of all, let me be absolutely clear. I believe we must accept the vote. I don't think we needed to have the vote. Referenda are not part of our constitution. And I think if we want to have constitutional referenda, we should have had different criteria than a simple majority. But the rules were clear, and we lost the vote, so we will have to go ahead with exit. That's clear. So that's democratic choice. Then the question, obviously, of interpreting what the vote was about. Well, actually, in some sense, we don't know because we haven't interviewed everybody. I don't know what you mean by civilizational lifestyle. I promise you gay marriage will continue.
I hope not.
We're not going, I promise you, gay marriage will continue. We are a civilized country. That is possibly a difference from some others. And we will continue to have abortion. And we won't reintroduce the death penalty just because we voted on this. So let me be clear on that. As far as prosperity is concerned, Britain was doing pretty well, and the mistakes we made in ruining our economy were entirely homegrown, namely the financial crisis. I won't go into sovereignty except to say that we've just demonstrated our sovereignty by the decision to leave. I don't know what else could demonstrate sovereignty. But the really big issue you made, which I think is the core one, is what role did immigration play in this? I was actually reasonably clear about this, but I will be even clearer now. A significant proportion of the British population, the estimates would be probably at least a third, do indeed dislike the European Union for exactly the reasons you give them. And it's probably a roughly constant share. About a third believe very strongly in national sovereignty and wanted to leave, and have wanted to leave pretty well consistently. Remember that 45%, if I remember correctly, no, maybe I can't remember, it's something like 45% voted against even in the first referendum, my memory is concerned. So the question is, how did you get from a third, or maybe 35%, to 52%? Who were the people who turned it over? It's not the average, the margin. There's absolutely no doubt, not the tiniest question, zero question, that the issue that shifted people in those undecided categories towards leaving was immigration. And if you don't believe me, I have some reading to recommend you. Dominic Cummings, who ran the Brexit campaign, has written a 20,000-word blog, which you should all read, about how this campaign was carried out and won, based on his meticulous polling. I happen to know him very well. He's a very close friend of members of my family and of my son-in-law. And his point was very simple. The core thing that shifted the campaign decisively was the harping on immigration and Turkey and the potential immigration, and in addition, importantly, the money that was supposedly going to come back from the EU that will be spent on the NHS, which won't, by the way, happen, but that's neither. Those were the issues that shifted what up to then had clearly been a campaign that the Leavers expected to lose. So it is perfectly true that the majority, probably the overwhelming majority of people who voted to leave, did so for reasons of national sovereignty and freedom. That was never more than 50% of the electorate, and the people who shifted it over from one side to the other, many of them former Labour supporters, were clearly people who were perfectly understandably, by the way, and perfectly legitimately concerned about migration. And this is just a matter of fact.
Okay. I think President Klaus raised a very important general issue, which is, I rather agree with him that this is maybe the key element of everything, the whole debate. This is a proportion between sovereignty and nation-state as a structural unit of international relations and supranational government. And in this regard, what you say about migration does not contradict, actually, because if people feel, rightly or wrongly, that migration issue cannot be solved in a bigger framework, of course they stick to the idea of sovereign. Maybe this is illusion, but it is. So that's why I would like to give the floor to Mr. Macedo, who, as I understand, you run the center, which is called Center for Globalization and Governance. And globalization was supposed to gradually undermine national sovereignty. Now we see rather in the opposite trend. Or is it true?
Well, thank you. I do run that center, CG&G, not a brand of Italian shoes. So yeah, and what I was going to do is just list the topics that I had prepared. I sent a paper, and they have that global view, because Europe, in its various forms, is a reflection of globalization that also reflects upon globalization. So this kind of flexible approach to Europe is very different from my dear friend and colleague. He said he was an economist, and indeed I've known him in that capacity, because flexible integration has very often been neglected. It was everything for everybody, everybody's the same. I am from Portugal. We are not similar to our neighbors, the Spaniards. We are not. No, you are laughing as an Austrian. I fully understand.
We have the same problem.
Okay, so we are not the same. And so the idea of flexible integration, which is a contribution that economists have made, is important. I will just list the points that I had. They apply broadly, and then I will zero in on one fundamental disagreement I have with previous speakers. So the first point of greater importance to me is that the European Union was part of what was called, it was in fact the product of what was called the North Atlantic Security Community. The North Atlantic Security Community happened after the war, and there have been a lot of studies in the 50s that it set the principles for countries to observe each other remaining different. This was called peer review mechanisms. It started at the OECD, but then, of course, it became a very important dimension of what the IMF was doing. And so Europe was a part of the North Atlantic Security Community. It allows interdependence to grow between countries so that the threats of external competition in trade of goods, services and assets, note I am not saying people, because we don't talk about trade in that connection, even though my country, of course, was a country of emigration during the 60s, it was already kind of part of the European Union in two ways. Not just the people went there, but they sent remittances. So the financial freedom of the Portuguese people was larger than it would seem from the statistics because of the emigration. So I want to be very clear on the importance of the security community, and we are now in doubt. We are in doubt about it. The two things that I want to zero in that justify some impatience with the European Union as it is. Great examples. One obvious that I talk in my paper. There were two reports on the future of Europe. One was the report from the European Security Policy Assessment System, ESPAS, that was going to see what the conflicts were at the borders compared to China and to the US. And then another one, better known, the Five Presidents Report. The first one only talked about the external dimension. The first one only talked about the internal dimension. Doesn't say one word about the outside world. This disconnect between the internal workings of the European Union and its external role are a problem. Because even though the European Union is big, certainly much bigger than the smaller and medium-sized countries that are there, it is small compared to the world. And so this disconnect is wrong from a policy standpoint, and that's an example I give of the difficulties in international cooperation. There is another one which is a little bit more subtle, but to my mind even more destructive. It has to do with the way in which structural reforms are designed and executed. They are very often designed, not implemented except under the threat of a crisis, and the minute the crisis disappears, they are backtracked. And this is a very bad way of proceeding. My own country has had that example. So the quality of policymaking is bad. At the moment in the European Union, you find the European and Monetary Union, the defense cooperation and the Schengen. You've mentioned this, that's exactly right. But they are divided by councils, just like the ministries in some countries. And they don't talk to each other. So there is a lot of inefficiency, and the quality of policy and reforms is lower. This goes in the literature, goes under the name of reform complementarity. In other words, does it move step by step, or is it one-shot, sort of cold turkey, as it's called, affair? One last point before I come to my disagreement, which is a mechanical point and is important for this variable geometry or this flexible integration I've been talking about. It is called the peer review system. As I said, it started out in the wake of the Marshall Plan, but then developed very strongly amongst various countries. It is a culture. It is, in a way, a reflection of the security dimension, the security community on one side, and the rising interdependence on the other. This peer review is extremely tight in the European community and even more in the Eurozone. Why? Because then you have a commission which has an authority, or the council, to force some things on the country if they agree. So it's something that it's done only if it is agreed. But of course, the best example of peer review in name is the IMF. The IMF, when it analyzes a country, it's always done by its board, and the countries are represented. But unless you have a seat yourself, of course, it's very often the managing director and the staff that decide. So that's not such a good example. The OECD is the perfect example. Countries examine. Luxembourg criticizes the US health system, and it appears in the press. Maybe nobody cares, maybe they do. But there is a culture of peer review. And the point I will submit to you today is that that system of peer review is notoriously absent from the world at large, from the globalization and governance. That's a governance innovation. I've been working with CG, a think tank in Waterloo, Ontario, nothing against the French there, which focuses on governance innovation. The peer review mechanism is a very important dimension that the G20 has ignored. You see, the G20 doesn't have a permanent secretariat. This was discussed in another session. But worse than that, perhaps, its way of analyzing the countries is done strictly by the IMF and doesn't have any teeth. It's very macroeconomic. It doesn't go into the depth to create what would be the equivalent of the security community amongst the largest countries in the world, and then perhaps rising interdependence. Okay, I come to my last point about the Eurozone. Martin, I have known him since, not before the FT was established, but before he joined. And I really like to disagree with him. And we have had one major disagreement over the times in which we have discussed, which is the Eurozone. You heard what he said, you didn't forget. Now, I was at the Maastricht Treaty. I actually signed, I put my name. This proud professor of economics writes the name under the Eurozone. Now, there is a book, a very nice book, about the Eurozone crisis, which talks about the ghosts of Maastricht. You evoke them. It is a no-nonsense cooperation between France and Germany, not an angst-ridden, but you trade off, you do again the peer review, the natural bargaining, and when that works, things are fine. But then there is a Maastricht stepchild. I am not the father of that stepchild, but I should have known. And I had some sense, but okay. I wasn't going to say to my prime minister, our common friend, Cavaco Silva, no, I'm not going to sign because of the stepchild. The stepchild is that the financial system was completely ignored in the Maastricht Treaty. So it was not, the banks were not either part of the single market or part of the monetary. They were somewhere. Now, when the banks and the financial system in general went into great difficulty in the global crisis, that had effects, not immediately, but again, this was something that, could it have been avoided? I don't think so, because the two countries there had a very different view of what the European monetary union would be like. For the French, it was an assertion of a new currency, a little bit against the dollar. The Germans didn't have that view. They wanted something that would work out, that would create stability, but not going against the North American security community, you see. So that, what seemed to be an agreement, was hiding an elephant, the financial system. Is that enough to criticize the Eurozone in the way in which it has been criticized? I don't think so, on one condition, that we believe that this 5 presidents report that has 2 stages and is now building a banking union and a capital markets union. By the way, the banking union is mostly for Eurozone. Capital markets union, of course, is for the whole European Union. And if that can progress with or without Britain, I am quite optimistic that if in 25 years, for the 50th anniversary of the Maastricht Treaty, I don't believe I will be in a position to sign, maybe only by email or something. But in that case, we will have solved the stepchild father. He would have graduated, maybe even have a PhD. So I am hopeful, and I believe the Eurozone will survive. And of course, that's not a problem, Brexit, because the Brits never would have joined, and they are still recovering from the dismal, very brief, but dismal passage they had in the euro, in the exchange rate mechanism. So I think it's a problem that, that will solve itself. It took long, it's true, so in that I agree, but I would certainly not despair of the Eurozone or indeed of the European Union. At this day, I think it will be strong if it remains open to the rest of the world. And that's the message here. It should tie more within the G20 and be more truthful to globalization and governance, to innovation in international governance. Did I go on for too long, Mr. Chairman? Please say no.
I say yes.
Oh, you say yes. So we disagree. That's not a problem.
Thank you very much. I think it's extremely interesting to listen to a person who nowadays admits that he was part of this Eurozone creation. So not everybody would like to do it now. But if you say that financial sector was totally ignored and banks were ignored, if so, then they took revenge, because who can destroy the Eurozone? I think banks are in the best position to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I must say about the courage that, I did do my military service in Angola. So, but I would not think that the problem, the way in which the Eurozone was lasting for the first 10 years led to a certain complacency, exactly what we were saying. But then, with the crisis, things woke up, and I believe it will be sorted out in the way I indicated. But yeah, one has to. I stand by what I signed. Okay. My British counterpart, by the way, was sued in Britain for having signed the treaty. I'm not applauded, but I'm not criticized either. Maybe I shouldn't even have mentioned it. Thank you.
Okay, but very briefly,
one
please,
sentence. Is it really a sentence? To make clear, when I criticized it 25 years ago, this was my mistake. It was not because of the financial sector emission. That turned out to be an additional problem. The problem, that is a big additional problem. The problem, in my view, was the inability of the Eurozone to manage internal macroeconomic adjustment reasonably smoothly. And if the last 8 years haven't proved that, I just don't know what could.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fischler, you are not only a representative of a respected country, Austria, but you, in this panel, you represent European Commission, where you served for a very long time. And I think it's important in this context because European Commission and Euro bureaucrats have been embodiment of evil for all those in Europe, be it in the UK or in other countries, who used to be called populist movements now. And we see that the European institutions are maybe not damaged yet, but hit by this new political atmosphere. Could you expect change in the architecture of European institutions due to this new situation, this new context?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me clarify that I left the European Commission more than 12 years ago, so I'm not responsible for the present policies. But I don't shy away from your question, because I think this is really the fundamental question. It is always attractive to follow a brilliant infight here, but our issue is Europe after Brexit. So this is the real question, and I think in this context I agree with two sentences of Mr. Klaus. He mentioned that a new chapter in Europe's history will be opened, and he said that Brexit is important for the whole Europe. And I would add to that, yes, we are really in the situation where a wake-up call for Europe is absolutely needed and urgent. And this has to have several elements. I think one of the fundamental things, which was partly discussed already, is the role of the representative democracy. Here, I think we should be a bit more careful with supporting referenda and such things. We are forgetting some of the fundamental principles how a democracy works. And I think the most sophisticated result a democracy can produce is a good compromise. But with referenda, you don't have compromises anymore, and this can then become dangerous, except Switzerland. I agree with you on that. But if we would like to favor much more all the right-wing parties in Europe, then we must call for many referendums. This is the biggest support we can give them. My second point is in relation to this decision-making process. We shouldn't forget that one of the results of the implementation of the Lisbon Treaty was that the European Council was very much strengthened, but the way how they operate, that they get more and more involved in all the micromanagement of the European Union, and that they have other forms of finding majorities. I think this is also not a very democratic procedure. And here, at the same time, with this kind of muddling through, which is the main way of the decision-making, or was the main way of the decision-making in the recent years, with this, the European institutions have less and less to say. They are excluded from the more and more from the decision-making process. So here, I think we have to change our practices, and we have to find ways how we can do better in this respect. My third point is that we are more and more in a situation in the European Union that we are not serious about ourselves. We make decisions, but at the same time, even a majority, if I think about the refugee problem, a majority of the member states announces that they will never implement this decision. And there the question is coming up, what do they want together in the future? And I think this is one of the biggest risks the European Union is facing, and this has to be changed. And my last point is really we need, and here the position of the UK could give some incentives or some input into that. We need to rethink what our understanding of subsidiarity and sovereignty is. Without that, I think there is a real risk that the European Union could collapse. But my final point, what do we mean when we speak about a potential collapse of the European Union? Does this mean that we will have then 28 pieces of a union, a total renationalization? I don't think so. I think the result, the most likely result would be that we have what is called the core Europe, with a few member states, and this group of member states will then implement also a model, a kind of Bundesstaat model, and they will then also agree on a real common foreign and security policy. They will also have majority decisions and not only unanimous decisions in this field. And finally, we will also have the big group of countries with a kind of common market, maybe with lower freedoms. The 4 freedoms could be a little bit watered down, but there will be at least a kind of custom union and a union with common standards and with common research policy and many other common things.
Thank you very much. We did hear about possibility of multi-speed Europe since quite a while. It's before the recent crisis. I always had doubts about how this model can function, because I can imagine the core is very difficult now, but theoretically it can be done, as you said, as a Bundesstaat. But how to manage other countries with different levels of rights, capacities, and basically abandoning the idea of equality between member states, I don't know, maybe there is a model, but I cannot imagine. This periphery, the so-called periphery, will be ungovernable in this situation. Maybe I'm wrong. Mr. Gros, you are known as one of the best specialists on the European economy and what is happening in the real world. So not what politicians used to say. Is Europe still as united and economically coherent as it was designed, despite the political trouble, or we can expect other implications?
Thanks. Yeah, I very much like to concentrate on the economy, which gets me away on all this loose talk about the European Union limiting sovereignty of people, and we have just seen that they can leave at any time. On the economy, I would say that actually the Eurozone is much better than actually it's portrayed. But it has an image problem, and a growing image problem. In terms of pure numbers, it is crawling back. The GDP numbers don't look very good, but in terms of employment, actually, we are back to the previous peak. And the only reason why unemployment remains high is that the labor force participation had increased. In the United States has gone down, therefore the unemployment has gone down. But in terms of employment relative to the population, the performance is not that much different. So I would say, internally speaking, the Eurozone is not where it should be, but it has a pretty solid recovery, which is not only, of course, having Germany at its core, but it's extending. And the countries which have problems, will continue to have problems, they have them with or without the euro. That in particular applies to Italy and Greece. Do you judge the United States economy on Puerto Rico, on Louisiana? These are also states which have continuously economic problems, are lagging behind Appalachia. We have them in the Eurozone as well. With the difference is that in Europe, then you say, it's the fault of the Euro. If only, and then comes, the Italians could save their banks. If only the Italians could spend more. If they could only devalue, everything would be okay and the situation would be much better. And I have very much my doubts that this if only is actually true, but it's not something you can prove. And therefore, of course, you come back to this a variant of what Martin Wolf earlier called aggrieved nationalism. You see your economy doesn't perform. You cannot admit it's your own fault. So it must be somebody else. It's Merkel, the ECB, German austerity, the euro. You say it, right? Brussels, of course, whatever, right? It's very convenient. You cannot prove what is proven. I'm saying if you look at, on the average, the Eurozone is not doing so badly. Many people complain about the Eurozone not being competitive in the global economy. If you look at the share of the EU in global exports of manufacturing, to limit ourselves to something, it has stayed constant over the last 15 years. That of the United States has gone down. That of China has gone up. Japan gone down. But that of the EU has stable, more or less been stable. So I think the ability, and without great devaluation, right? The euro has gone down, up and down and sideways. It's more or less where it was. So I think all this talk about Europe being doomed to failure from an economic point of view, we have had that over the last years, every year. It's vastly overrated. What is true is there has been an extraordinarily important demographic change. And here it's very important to understand, we're not talking about that the numbers suddenly go down. The growth rate has changed in the working age population of the Eurozone from basically being plus something until 2005 to, from now on onwards, minus half a percentage point perhaps. Migration doesn't change that because the numbers are too small and the productivity of the people who are coming is too small and their labor force participation is even small. So it doesn't change. So the Eurozone is very likely to face a future similar to that of Japan. Per capita, per working capita, things look okay. More or less like the US. But since the total number of people working or actually is diminishing, the growth rate will diminish, and everybody will say, the euro. Right? And that's what I mentioned, the image problem, a bit like in Japan. You had the 3 arrows, 1, 2, 3. With this kind of demographics you have in Japan, you cannot expect much. And in the euro area, you have the same. Now, what I grant is that on top of that, you have, if you want something which does not contribute at present to the global equilibrium, which is a very large amount of excess savings. The older population plus the internal constraints, they have contributed to a large amount of excess savings. Nota bene, Japan has had the same phenomenon without austerity. So again, to say this is all Europe, Brussels, austerity, I think misses the point. But the Eurozone is now 15% of the global economy. As I said, it's not an ideal contributor to a global equilibrium, I grant it, but it is something that I think the world economy can deal with, to have this graying area, to run a large current account surplus until it becomes so gray that it actually then has to consume what it has invested beforehand. Therefore, I would say in terms of overall economy, the Eurozone is not doing too badly. In terms of differences across member states, I would say these differences are in the first instance structural, national specific. It's the quality of the public administration in Italy and in Greece, which is behind the growth problem these countries have. These problems cannot be solved in Brussels because of sovereignty. The Eurozone can force the Italian government to make some laws, and they come every year diligently with a reform of the public administration. And every year they make a new budget to please some rules. It doesn't change how the country below is governed. It doesn't change the underperformance.
Is to ask, especially having Martin Wolf in the room. I mean, as a macroeconomist, whatever Mr. Gros is saying, the unbalances of the eurozone are absolutely threatening. Like 10%, 9 point something percent surplus of the German balance of payments. It's a much bigger unbalance worldwide than the 10% of the Chinese GDP surplus 15 years ago. And this cannot adjust because of the exchange rate being fixed between countries. I mean, very one sentence. So there is Article 50 for the European Union. There is nothing alike for the Eurozone, which could be actually something more convenient because it's an empty page, so it could be written by the Council at any moment. But knowing these unbalances, Mr. Wolf, how do you see the thing evolving and what will happen knowing that the current situation is not sustainable on the medium term as it is?
Okay, more questions? Translation. Here.
I have a question for Mr. Gros, and I suppose for other participants as well. You made a comparison to Japan, but from economic perspective. But let's move to socio-cultural perspective, I would say. For example, Islamization, as we all believe, was a part of a process that led to Brexit. But in comparison to Europe, in Japan, Islam is very hugely restricted. Everyone knows it, but I never heard European liberals or leftish politicians that criticize Japan for that, but it's a fact. Islam is hugely restricted in Japan. From my perspective, this is quite different from European case. That's why maybe all this criticism that has arose against bureaucrats, against European Commission, against European Union, is quite different. That, I mean, even if economic results are more or less comparable to Japan, or maybe to the United States, from social cultural perspective, is quite different. Don't you think that this difference would initially lead to more cases like Brexit, even if economic results are more or less comparable with Japan or United States?
Hi, I would like to ask Mr. Lambsdorff, what will happen after the Brexit with the process of EU enlargement, especially, let's say, with focus on the countries from Southwest Balkans? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Maria, Sputnik News Agency. So some notes on Brexit have raised concern that the French are likely to be the most difficult nation to negotiate with. So a question for you, Mr. Lambsdorff. What would François Fillon mean for Brexit if he wins the French presidential elections? And the next question, what would it mean for the European Union without the UK? And another question, Angela Merkel has told her own party Congress so that Britain will not be allowed to cherry pick in Brexit negotiations. So what do you think, who will be the winner in this sort of competition? Madam May or Angela Merkel? Thank you.
Okay, another question here, and then we go to the panel.
My name is Alexey Semenov. I'm a political scientist, and I would like to raise the issue of the problems identified during the United Kingdom European Union membership referendum. Firstly, theoretically, the decision may change at the revote because the Remain and the Leave figures were very close. This problem did not exist, for example, at the referendum of Montenegro's independence because there was a 55% pro-independence vote threshold imposed. Thus, the gap in votes had to be more than 10%. However, in case of the United Kingdom, the gap between the leaves and remains was at the level of statistical error. And secondly, voters are used to the fact that the decisions are valid for a limited period of time, and regularly, once in several years, they are able to correct their votes as they will. But the validity of referendum seems to be indefinite. Hence, people cannot correct their last-minute votes.
Okay, we have very wide range of different questions. Then, okay, just one, and then we have no time more, unfortunately.
Thank you. My name is Oksana, and I have degree in PR, and I'm big a fan of House of the Card for season. Me and as many Russian as well have read Investigation Das magazine, am I right? About power of social media. Do you believe, and what's your opinion about the role of social media and big data for Brexit victory and for Donald Trump victory? Thank you.
Well, further and further from initial topic. Okay, maybe we start in the reverse order as it used to be done. Daniel.
Yeah, the question was, can Japan, like Eurozone, survive because it's politically and socially so much more heterogeneous? And that is indeed the big question mark. And as I said, it's also an image problem because in Japan people wouldn't say, oh, my part of the country doesn't prosper because it's the yen or whatever. Nor did you have that question in the case of Puerto Rico. So that will make it, as I said, very difficult. But as I said, if you look just at the number and don't look at the people if you want, if you look at the people who have been employed, then the numbers don't look so bad. What is, however, also in the background, and this I think was a fundamental question of, not of economics, but of identity, which many countries are facing. Basically, are we immigration societies? That already goes to the core of how you consider your own country. And you can have full employment or not, it doesn't really matter. This is a key question, and which has, on the face of it, very little to do with your membership of the European Union or the Eurozone. But as we have seen in the UK, it gets all muddled up. In Japan, a clear decision has been taken. We are not an immigration society. We might be aging, we might be disappearing slowly, but that's it. We'll remain Japanese. In Germany, here perhaps Alexander is more of an expert, we have had that discussion for almost 20 years now, but the discussion has shifted over time, right? As the facts on the ground have shifted. And other countries are very different places. So coming back on the question, we have this fundamental issue for basically all European countries. It has not been finally settled. It won't be settled by a French election, but we get some indication. And the problem is that it's always linked up in some strange and incoherent way with the question of the euro and the European Union. And this is what makes the cohesion within the EU so difficult, because you get this link which goes to the core of how you feel about your own country. Even it has very little to do with the EU as it is in reality. And that, I think, is the greatest threat also for the EU and will remain for quite some time.
Franz.
Yeah, there was the question related to the Lisbon Treaty. Let us be clear. The Lisbon Treaty was the second best solution. Yeah? The first solution in the beginning was to have a constitutional treaty, but the constitutional treaty failed because of the referenda in the Netherlands and in France. But I would say that in this respect, because there's already for some years a discussion going on whether one should organize a new a new event so that one can prepare a new constitution or changes of the Lisbon Treaty and so on. I would say in this respect that Brexit will help to come to a new convention, because a convention is nowadays in the European Union, whether we like it or not, but is a precondition to change the treaty.
President.
No, there was almost no question to me, because everything was crystal clear in my presentation, which I appreciate. Just this is very simple. I just want to say one thing. Many times you mentioned migration, immigration, emigration, and so on, and debate whether it was an important factor in the Brexit decision of the Brits. I have to make a propaganda. At 6 o'clock here somewhere is a presentation of my book about migration, published in the Russian language. So today at 6 o'clock, after Czech, German, Swedish, and Dutch version, there is the Russian version tonight. So who is interested, please, at 6 o'clock somewhere here?
President Klaus, can we maybe address the question about enlargement? Whether enlargement will continue now of the European Union?
Well, I'm afraid that there is absolutely, and I remember all the debates in the EU when I participated in EU summits, and so the debate about enlargement was lost. It doesn't exist anymore. It does not exist. To be fair and to make it clear, really. Of course, some of the politicians, when they make a speech, they continue talking about future enlargement, but practically it's a lost game for an imaginable, for a foreseeable future, as far as I see it.
Okay, thank you. Jorge.
Thank you. I do want to react to my Spanish brother. We don't have the same notion of what it is to be the same. No, it's not philosophical. I'm not German either. I think this is of relevance because it brings back the point about Japan. So the issue about the European Union, it is, of course, they are very different, and there are differences within countries. I don't need to remind you about the differences within Spain. So they exist, but the foreign policy is seen as something that's centralized. Nobody projects onto foreign policy whatever differences they may have, even almost to the point when secession might loom. And that's different because in the European peoples, from my knowledge and experience, they very often have a different idea of Europe. Some countries are very excited about federalism because they have that experience. That's certainly the case of Germany. Other countries are very centralized, and they would like perhaps to be a little bit less centralized. Maybe that's France, and I'm bringing the two together because, of course, they are the ghosts of Maastricht. So I press this point because the idea of Europe need not be the same, and that matters for European construction. This allows me to reply to the gentleman who asked why we didn't speak about Russia. Well, as it turns out, I did. And I did not in an innocent or irrelevant point. Russia is in the G20. The G20 is also composed of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now South Africa. Those countries do not have a procedure of observing each other in the way of the peer review. So this was a point, again, of foreign policy from the European standpoint, saying we count on Russia. Russia used to be extremely active on African affairs. It had a view, which I don't happen to agree with, but it had a view. Sometimes one fears that Russia may be becoming too inward-looking, and that, I think, is bad for globalization and for governance. So I did talk about Russia. Thank you.
Well, thank you for all the questions, many interesting ones, really. I want to correct a factual mistake, though. The outcome of the Brexit referendum was clear. It was not within the statistical margin of error. There was more than 1 million votes. It was 52 to 48%. So there is no second guessing, this notion that, perhaps the result will be declared void. That brings me to the question, has the point of no return been reached? Technically, no. Britain can, technically speaking, legally speaking, say, ta-da, we stay. They can do that. Politically, however, in a democracy, in a mature, real democracy like the United Kingdom, I believe that that would sort of do away with the entire political class. Because the people would say, you're not taking us seriously, but this is a democracy, and we voted, and this is the result, and you have to respect it. That's also what I say to Václav. We respect the result. We may regret it, but we respect it. That's democracy. So I think that they haven't reached the point. Technically, politically, maybe Martin has a different view on that. Second, does Russia benefit from Brexit? Now, there are two theories. One theory is Russia is interested in weakening the existing structures of cooperation, the United Nations, the OSCE, the European Union, whatever. That's a theory. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying I'm subscribing to it. If that theory is true, yes, of course, then if we don't get our act together, Russia would benefit. The other theory is that compared to the other parts of its neighborhood, of Russia's neighborhood, stability in Western Europe is actually something that's quite positive for it. It's a big market. We buy gas. We buy oil. Many Russians travel to Western Europe all the time, stay there, live there, study there, etc. And so, in that sense, if you want a stable Western Europe, the weakening of the cooperative structures there, i.e. the European Union, is not something that Russia would benefit from. Now, let's wait. Marie, François Fillon would be tougher for the negotiations than Emmanuel Macron, I believe. But by and large, at the end of the day, we all have to agree on a position. And it's Michel Barnier who's negotiating on behalf of the European Union. And he's going to be a tough cookie. There was a joke in Brussels going around that the Brexit negotiations will actually be conducted in French. That would have been very nice for our English friends. So May versus Merkel, that's not really the issue. The issue is, will the UK and the EU be able to reach a deal that benefits both sides, at least as far as is possible under the circumstances? Last question, Oksana, power of social media for Brexit and Donald Trump's election. Well, a month or 2 months ago, I would have said, well, yeah, probably very important. But François Fillon in France just won his primary by basically ignoring social media and stuffing his program, his platform on paper into mailboxes. He won it that way. It was traditional media. So I don't think social media should be overestimated. Not underestimated, but also not overestimated. And my very, very, very last point is, you will have, and I envy you for this, the Football World Cup in this country next year. And whenever we discuss migration and immigration, remember the countries that usually win, Argentina, Brazil, Germany and Spain. And France has won as well. Portugal has only won the European Championship.
I know, but you could mention.
Yes. Portugal has won the European Championship. But if you look at the German national team when it comes here next year, it is a team that is composed of people who have Polish names, African names, Turkish names, German names. It is, for us, a reflection of our society, and it's our most successful, one of our proudest things that we have, that we are the reigning champion of the world in football. Why? Because we have been able in sports, and that happens in every village in Germany every day without political discussions, to have the different people play together and achieve something great together. That is what makes us strong. And that is why an open country like Germany we've had this discussion for 25 years, but now we're really an open country, will be able to absorb migration as a matter of fact, because we are a graying and aging society, just like Russia. We don't have enough babies. We need migration. And that's why I think when you have this football competition here next year, look at the teams, and then we'll see which team is going to be the most successful one. I bet it's a team from a country that is open to migration.
You know, many people in this country would agree with you that the Russian football team would be much better if we replace all those with Russian names with somebody with other names. Please, Martin, final word.
Okay. I'm going to try and be very disciplined, though so many fascinating questions have been raised which directly to me. On the Brexit-related questions, can Brexit be reversed? I think what has been said here is basically correct. It's never say never. But technically, it will be possible not to apply for Article 50, and there is a debate among professional experts on whether it would be possible to reverse the application before the process has reached its end. The people I trust, and I can list them, but I won't here because some of it's private, believe it would technically be possible to halt the process after we have invoked Article 50. However, I think this is completely theoretical because it's already been implied. The government would fall. The government would fall, and so it stands. That links to the second question. I'm not going to get into the question of what you mean by the statistical margin of error in a vote of 35 billion people or so, but the 33 million. But the important point is the rules were the rules, and we all knew what the rules were. My own view, for what it's worth, and I've written this, is if we are now in the position that we treat referenda as the way of settling constitutional questions, because the nature of the questions, as the point, this is in response to the issue that was raised, is that the decision is essentially irreversible or extremely difficult to reverse. It's a permanent decision. Then you have to open the possibility, which has been mentioned, and I believe, that the requirement for a change in the status quo should be greater than a simple majority. But we have never addressed and discussed this issue in the UK, but I think if we now treat these as constitutional issues, making a constitutional decision on a simple majority in a referendum is unwise. And that's why most constitutions are amended by require some sort of supermajority. Did the social media play a role? I believe in Brexit, not much, but some. But in British case, and I think the cases are very different. Britain and US are very different. In the British case, the media that mattered were the old media, and particularly the media owned by Rupert Murdoch and Lord Rothermere. They were the decisive factor. France will be incredibly difficult, without a doubt. Whether it will be the most difficult, I don't know. I suspect there is going to be a lot of close competition for that position, which is why I think we won't reach a deal. That's why I said at the beginning, we won't reach a deal and we will crash out. This is not going to be a reasonable and rational process. Political processes very rarely are. Yeah, okay, that's that. Then that leaves me, I must comment on this. Would Russia benefit from the weakened Europe? Well, the only answer to that question is, I've got to be philosophical, it depends what you mean by benefit. If you regard the aim of international relations to be strong relative to your neighbors and to push them around, then it seems to me that it's completely rational to want the European Union to disintegrate, China to implode, and the United States to disappear. If, however, because then Russia will be the most powerful country in the world. If your aim is, however, to live in a relatively peaceful, stable, and prosperous world in which you can participate, then I think it will be in your your interest to keep the European Union together. You decide what your national objectives are. And the final point I wanted to make, Daniel made so many important points, and I disagree with so many of them, but I'd just like to make 2 points about because we haven't discussed the Eurozone mess. One, Italy is different from Louisiana. And here I agree, I think, completely with Václav Klaus. I'm not so far from him on sovereignty. Well, I'm British. Italy is a country. It's not really a perfect example. It's only been around since 1860, but it is a country, and people know where political loyalty and allegiance lies. Louisiana is not a country, I think. Alabama, I'm not so sure. It's a great deal in the Eurozone. It's the biggest single beneficiary of the Eurozone. And let us be quite clear, it's also a big problem for the Eurozone. Somebody has to say that here, and that just seems to be the case. And is this surprising? Is this surprising? No, it's not at all surprising. And that's why, specifically, precisely, I argued forcefully in my paper to keep us out of the euro, because I knew that's how it was bound to work.
Ladies and gentlemen, as it was rightly pointed out, we did not speak much about Russia. From my point of view, fortunately, because that would bring us to completely different framework, which is, in this context, less interesting. But I think Martin made a very, very right conclusion, even if we take this element. It's up to Russia to decide what our incentives are. And it's absolutely senseless to ask Europeans to do it for us. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the forum.